speaking of guys we could start with this. Mark Carroll, who asked via email, hello, gentlemen. Florian Xhekaj is 19 and his birth date is in June. Does this mean we can expect him in Laval next season? Speaking of guys who could push at center, Florian Xhekaj, I think because he started, it's tough to say whether we can expect him in Laval. He's obviously there'd be an option. There's no indication one way or the other where he would be playing next year. I think with the massive jump he took this year in Brantford, it could be reasonable to think that he's ready for the next level. Like, he's never had this productive of a year. He didn't have it in junior B. He didn't have it in minor hockey. Like, it's just like every year that's been documented by elite prospects has never shown any production like the one that we saw this year from Florian Xhekaj. Interesting note on him. I was talking to Arber about him the other day, Arber Xhekaj, and so I thought they just kind of randomly shifted him to center, but apparently he's played center his whole life. Like, it was just last season when he got to the OHL where they moved him to the wing to kind of ease him in. But he's a natural center, and he's just been ripping it up. So it's him playing center. I don't know if he'll play center in the NHL. I don't know if he'll even play in the NHL for that matter. But him being a center, kind of being added to that mix in the middle with Beck and whoever else, there's not that many centers in the pipeline. It's pretty interesting. Mesher has also been playing a lot of center in Kitchener, which I find interesting. But yeah, I don't have any indication one way or the other, Mark, where if he would play in Laval next year, but he would be allowed to for that, if that answers your question.
Yeah, instead of going back to a 20-year-old season in Hamilton. He's got 2 years in the OHL.
Brantford, not Hamilton.
Well, actually, aren't they in Brantford only because they're renovating the Cups? I thought that
they changed their
Brantford
name.
Move was... Yeah?
Well, they're called the Brantford Bulldogs, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I think
because they're playing in Brantford.
Right, but if it was just temporary, wouldn't they still be called the Hamilton Bulldogs? Like when the Raptors played in Tampa, they didn't change their name to the Tampa Raptors, you know?
No, I'm ashamed that I don't know the exact clear-cut situation on that.
That's all right.
But you look at the Bulldogs, though. They have a couple. I mean, they have a couple of guys that are still rather young on that team. So maybe that there's also, where can you have the biggest impact? You know, if the Bulldogs head into next season thinking that they've got what it takes to make a run at the Memorial Cup, for example, it's probably a good thing if Xhekaj goes back there as a 20-year-old and leads that team, as opposed to be one of many young players in Laval scraping for ice time, and he ends up being like a fourth liner and waits his turn behind this guy or that guy. It's good to be in a situation where you're going to play significant minutes, and the fact that he only has two seasons of OHL hockey in him, it's not as though, you know, he's got 4 and he's got nothing else to learn. He's still developing. He's a great story, but I think that he could be in a position there where he leads the Bulldogs next season, and he'd probably be in a more advantageous situation. It's a lower caliber, but in terms of development, there would definitely be something to gain from playing that 20-year-old season there. So,
yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised if they suggested that he'd stay there and benefit. Just even organizationally, it's also buying time for them. It's useful.
Yeah. So let's kind of piggyback on that whole and stay with the family. So we got a question from Ed Tamboni, or Tambini. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right. He's been a huge Habs fan for over 50 years. J.C. Tremblay, Pete Mahovlich are my favorite players. Now Arber Xhekaj is quickly becoming a favorite. My question is, since no one ever saw enough in him to draft him, where did his development occur? What happened to make someone, a coach, a scout, to say, hey, take a look at this player? Where did the change occur in Arber?
Yeah, okay, I can answer that one. So, because it did happen. There was such a scout in Montreal.
Yes,
So
there was.
for more than a decade, there was a former Canadian scout named Matt Turek, who's now running the Bulldogs. He's the GM there. So he's been running a summer hockey camp at the Mohawk Four Eyes Center in Hamilton. So it's like a 4-on-4 league in the summer, and so they've got kids there that are like minor hockey development. That you've got junior guys and you've got the pros. And Arber Xhekaj has been participating at this hockey camp for many years, and the progress that he showed Turek from one year to the next was significant enough that at some point Turek started bugging the rest of the Canadian scouting staff, Martin Lapointe being one of them, and say, "Hey, you need to take a look at this guy." So that's how he arrived on the Canadiens' radar, through Turek's insistence. So Xhekaj was never listed in the by Central Scouting, so that he was really off the radar. He went undrafted twice. Let's start with that. He's undrafted twice. Then the OHL canceled their season because of the pandemic in 2021. Turek adapted his summer school and his summer camp to make it available to those who were not playing. So Xhekaj went to that camp, had to pay for it, and that's when he ended up working at Costco for all this time, stocking shelves and whatnot. And then went undrafted the third time. But then at that point, the Canadiens had him on their draft list for 2 years. So the second time and the third time that he went undrafted, he was somewhere on the Canadiens list. But the third time, they pondered, the possibility of drafting him. And eventually they said, okay, he's 19-year-old. He's going to play his 20-year-old season in the OHL next year. There's a good chance that he might slip through the cracks and that he's not going to get drafted at all. If he's not, we'll invite him to our camp. They were not the only teams to submit an invitation. The Florida Panthers did too. But then, because of Matt Turek's connection with Montreal, because also the Montreal Canadiens were Arber's father's favorite team, he chose to go with Montreal. And from that point, the rest is history. But there was indeed a scouting connection, somebody who saw him, you could argue, before everybody else. So it didn't come for Arber Xhekaj and the Canadiens. It didn't come out of the blue. They had, I would argue, a more significant book on him than other teams just because of Matt Turek.
Well, I mean, the Florida Panthers connection, their director of scouting, amateur scouting, is Shane Churla. He would have been privy to some of those pleas from Matt Turek about Arber Xhekaj. The only thing I would add to that is I spoke to Jonathan Kovacevic about this because he was also at those camps during the pandemic. He comes from just south of Hamilton. And so he's, his memory of Arber Xhekaj in those camps was kind of like, so he was in the pro group, even though he wasn't yet an NHL player, but he was a drafted player. And he just remembers thinking, like, who is this guy? Like, who is this guy who's playing in a pretty high caliber camp, and not only holding his own, but like shit talking. Like, who is this guy? Like, who is this guy who's like, who's getting a little rough with me and who's like talking smack on the ice and all this? Like, I want to know who this guy is. And so like, he like made an effort to kind of get to know him, but like, he's like, the confidence that Xhekaj had in that environment was really impressive for him to see. Undrafted guy, no one knew him.
Yeah.
And he just walked in there like he owned the place. Was kind of what Kovacevic said. Like, so that swagger that you see now existed then when he was working at Costco, so he could pay for the ice time and all. Like, the Costco thing never diminished the swagger. Like, he showed up there like he belonged, and it really it made an impression on the participants in that camp. And like, you would think a camp in the Hamilton area, that's probably a pretty there's some names at that camp skating there, and that guy didn't care. Just didn't care. Just showed up and just broad shoulders, swaggering in.
Yeah, actually, he would have been. I mean, he was supposed to be with the junior group, and it's the pros at that camp that asked Turek, say, "Hey, can this guy come with us?" So the pros saw that he had that component, that ingredient in him that would raise the level of competition for the pros there. So, yeah, for sure there were some guys that were intrigued. And you mentioned Costco. Yeah. I mean, for a story that I wrote when I was at the Athletic, I briefly spoke to his boss at Costco,
the manager,
Sarah.
He still says it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. He spoke to Sarah. The look on Arber's face every time he said the word Sarah. Yeah. I think her name was Sarah. Was Sarah?
Yeah, she was not. She didn't want to. She said that comment. No, she said that those things were private matters and there was confidentiality. Yeah. So she hid behind that.
I remember when you spoke to her and the story came out on him while we were on the road. The Canadiens were on the road and I was on that trip and you weren't. Yeah. So I got to tell Arber that you actually spoke to Sarah. It's like, hey, my buddy was writing that story. Marc-Antoine was writing that story about you. And he actually spoke to your manager. It's like, what? Oh, he spoke to Sarah? It was so funny. Anyhow.